Sometimes the smallest symbols carry the heaviest weight. In a world where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell wore an insignia that made her fellow soldiers snicker behind her back. They saw a young woman with soft hands and a clean uniform. Someone who had never felt the sting of enemy fire or the weight of a fallen comrade. They saw everything except the truth. But in one moment, when a Navy SEAL commander asked a single question that cut through years of assumptions, the laughter died in their throats. What they discovered about her insignia would make them question everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve. This is the story of how one woman's quiet strength silenced an entire room of warriors, and why sometimes the most powerful battles are fought not with weapons, but with unwavering dignity in the face of doubt. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg, as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her uniform one final time before entering the briefing room. At 26, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of training, but today felt different. Today she would meet the elite team she had been assigned to work with, men who had seen combat in places most people couldn't pronounce. Sarah's fingers unconsciously traced the small insignia pinned to her collar, a habit she had developed over the past year. The metal felt warm against her fingertips, a constant reminder of why she wore it and what it represented. She had no idea that this simple gesture would soon become the center of unwanted attention. The briefing room buzzed with conversation as Sarah entered. 23 men in various military uniforms filled the space, their voices a mixture of different accents and experiences. The room felt quiet as she walked to an empty seat near the front. She could feel their eyes on her, sizing her up, making judgments based on what they saw. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to notice the insignia. He nudged the soldier next to him, Corporal James, and pointed discreetly toward Sarah's collar. James squinted, trying to make out the details of the small pin, then whispered something to the man beside him. Within minutes, a chain of whispered observations had spread throughout the room. Sarah pretended not to notice the stares and hushed conversations. She had experienced this before, though never with such intensity. She opened her notebook and reviewed her notes, trying to focus on the upcoming mission briefing, rather than the growing attention her presence was generating. Master Sergeant Thompson, a grizzled veteran with 3 tours in Afghanistan under his belt, leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah with unconcealed skepticism. He had been in the military for 15 years and had never seen an insignia quite like the one she wore. It wasn't standard issue, that much was certain. The design was unique, unlike anything in the official military handbook he knew by heart. Must be some kind of special achievement pin, Thompson muttered to his neighbor, Sergeant First Class Williams, though I can't figure out what for. Williams, who prided himself on knowing military decorations and insignia better than most, shook his head slowly. I've never seen anything like it either. Maybe it's from some training program? You know how they give out pins for everything these days. The speculation grew bolder as more soldiers joined the conversation. Some suggested it might be a participation award from a military academy. Others wondered if it was related to some administrative role or desk job. The common thread in all their theories was the underlying assumption that whatever the insignia represented, it couldn't be anything too significant. Private First Class Anderson, the youngest member of the team at just 19, felt emboldened by the whispered conversations around him. He had been trying to prove himself to the older soldiers since joining the unit, and saw this as an opportunity to gain some respect through humor. Maybe it's for perfect attendance, Anderson whispered loud enough for several people to hear. A few chuckles rippled through the nearby seats. Encouraged by the response, he continued, or maybe it's for best handwriting in administrative reports. The laughter grew a bit louder, though most of the soldiers tried to keep their voices down. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she continued studying her notes. She had learned long ago that responding to such comments usually only made things worse. Sergeant Martinez, who had served 2 tours in Iraq, felt comfortable enough to add his own observation. I bet it's one of those feel-good awards they give out to boost morale. You know, like outstanding effort in non-combat situations or something like that. The room's atmosphere had shifted from curious observation to barely concealed mockery. What started as innocent speculation had evolved into something more mean-spirited. Several soldiers were now openly staring at Sarah's insignia, making jokes just loud enough for her to hear while maintaining plausible deniability if confronted. Captain Harris, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, noticed the growing tension but chose not to intervene immediately. He had seen this dynamic before when new personnel joined established teams, especially when those new members seemed different from the norm. He hoped the situation would resolve itself once the briefing began and everyone focused on the mission at hand. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares and the sting of their whispered jokes, but she had experienced worse. During her time at the military intelligence school, she had faced similar skepticism from instructors and fellow students who questioned whether she belonged in their program. She had learned to let her work speak for itself rather than trying to defend herself with words. The insignia they were mocking had been carefully chosen by Sarah's commanding officer from her previous assignment. It was a symbol that held deep personal significance, though she had never felt the need to explain its meaning to anyone who hadn't earned the right to know. The design incorporated elements that spoke to sacrifice, dedication, and a type of service that most people would never understand. As the minutes ticked by, the jokes became more elaborate. Someone suggested that the insignia might be for exceptional coffee-making skills, while another proposed it was for outstanding performance in avoiding actual danger. Each comment drew more laughter and encouraged further speculation. Corporal Jackson, who had been largely silent until now, decided to add his own theory. Maybe it's one of those new diversity pins they're handing out, to make sure everyone feels included regardless of their actual contribution. This comment drew the biggest laugh yet, and several soldiers nodded in agreement. The suggestion that Sarah's insignia was somehow related to special treatment rather than earned recognition resonated with some of the men who felt that military standards had been lowered in recent years. Sarah's knuckles whitened as she gripped her pen more tightly, but her expression remained neutral. She had faced this type of assumption before, the idea that her achievements were somehow less valid because of her gender or because she didn't fit the traditional image of a combat soldier. It never got easier to hear, but she had learned to channel her frustration into determination. The conversation might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Commander Robert Steele Patterson, the Navy SEAL who would be leading their joint operation. His entrance immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. At 38, Patterson had earned his nickname through 15 years of distinguished service, including multiple deployments to some of the world's most dangerous locations. Patterson's presence commanded instant respect. His weathered face and confident bearing spoke of someone who had seen and done things that most people only read about in newspapers. The room fell silent as he walked to the front, his eyes scanning the assembled soldiers with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating team dynamics quickly. "Good morning," Patterson said, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of leading men in life-or-death situations. "I trust you've all had time to review the preliminary mission materials." As he spoke, Patterson's gaze moved methodically across the room, making brief eye contact with each soldier. When his eyes reached Sarah, they lingered for just a moment longer than the others. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested recognition, though of what no one in the room could say. The soldiers straightened in their chairs, suddenly aware that their casual mockery might have been inappropriate. Patterson had a reputation for having little patience with unprofessional behavior, and several of the men wondered if their earlier comments had been overheard. "This operation will require the best from each of you," Patterson continued, moving to stand behind the podium. "We're dealing with a situation that demands not just physical courage, but also intelligence, adaptability, and absolute trust in your teammates." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "I've reviewed each of your files, and I selected this team based on specific qualifications and experiences. Everyone in this room brings something essential to the mission's success." As Patterson spoke, some of the soldiers who had been making jokes about Sarah's insignia began to feel a twinge of uncertainty. If the commander had personally selected her for the team, perhaps their assumptions about her qualifications had been premature. But the damage to the room's atmosphere had already been done. Sarah sat perfectly still, her training having taught her to maintain composure regardless of the circumstances. She had no way of knowing that within the next few minutes, a single question from Commander Patterson would change everything. The other soldiers thought they knew about her, her insignia, and the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The stage was set for a revelation that would silence the mockery forever and force every person in the room to confront their own assumptions about courage, honor, and what it truly means to serve one's country. The insignia they had dismissed as meaningless was about to reveal a story that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman sitting among them. Commander Patterson moved to the center of the room, his eyes methodically scanning each face before him. The mission briefing materials lay spread across the table, but something else had caught his attention. The atmosphere in the room felt different than what he expected from a professional military briefing, and his years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts about team dynamics. "Before we begin the operational briefing," Patterson said, his voice carrying that particular tone that made seasoned soldiers pay attention, "I want to address something that seems to be creating a distraction." The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly very interested in their notebooks or the ceiling tiles. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez felt his stomach tighten, wondering if their earlier comments had been overheard after all. Patterson's gaze moved deliberately around the room before settling on Sarah, but instead of the stern reprimand that many expected, his expression softened slightly, showing what might have been respect, or perhaps something deeper. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, his voice now carrying a different quality entirely. "I notice you're wearing the Gold Star family insignia." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Every head turned towards Sarah, but this time the looks weren't mocking or curious. They were confused, uncertain, and for some tinged with the beginning of understanding. Those who knew what a Gold Star family insignia meant felt their hearts skip a beat. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her collar, her fingers touching the small pin that had been the subject of so much unwelcome attention. For a moment, her carefully maintained composure wavered, and those closest to her could see something raw and painful flash across her face before she regained control. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, her voice steady despite the emotions that Patterson's recognition had stirred. Private First Class Anderson, who had made some of the crueler jokes earlier, felt his face flush hot with embarrassment and confusion. He didn't know what a Gold Star family insignia was, but the sudden change in the room's atmosphere made it clear that his ignorance had led him to mock something sacred. Sergeant Martinez leaned over to whisper to Corporal James, "What's a Gold Star family insignia?" But James just shook his head, his own lack of knowledge making him feel smaller by the minute. Around the room, similar whispered questions revealed that many of the soldiers, despite their experience, were unfamiliar with this particular symbol. Master Sergeant Thompson, however, knew exactly what it meant, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His face had gone pale, and he found himself unable to meet Sarah's eyes. A Gold Star family insignia was worn by immediate family members of military personnel who had been killed in action while serving their country. It was one of the most solemn honors in the American military tradition. Commander Patterson saw the recognition dawning on some faces and the continued confusion on others. He made a decision that would change the trajectory of not just this briefing, but of how every person in the room would view service, sacrifice, and the quiet courage that some people carry every day. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Patterson said, his voice now carrying the weight of ceremony, "would you be willing to share with the team why you wear that insignia?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Sarah looked around the room at the faces that had been mocking her just minutes before. Some looked ashamed, others confused, but all were now paying attention in a way they hadn't been before. Sarah took a deep breath, her training warring with her emotions. She had never wanted to use her personal tragedy as a shield or a weapon. She had always believed that her work should speak for itself, that she shouldn't have to explain her pain to earn respect. But looking at Commander Patterson's face, she understood that this wasn't about defending herself. It was about education, about helping these men understand something they had never been taught. "My brother, Captain David Mitchell, was killed in action in Afghanistan 3 years ago," Sarah began, her voice quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. "He was leading a convoy escort mission when his vehicle hit an IED. He was 28 years old." The silence in the room was deafening. Several soldiers stared down at their hands, unable to look at Sarah as she continued. The jokes they had made about her insignia now seemed not just inappropriate, but cruelly ignorant. "The Gold Star family insignia is worn by immediate family members of service personnel who have made the ultimate sacrifice," Sarah continued, her fingers still touching the pen. "My brother died protecting the convoy he was escorting. 6 families went home safe that day because David did his job." Corporal Jackson, who had made the comment about diversity pins, felt physically sick. He thought about his own younger sister and tried to imagine how he would feel if someone mocked a symbol of her death. The shame was overwhelming, but he forced himself to keep listening. Sarah's voice remained steady, but those watching closely could see the slight tremor in her hands. David always said that service wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when no one was watching, even when no one would ever know your name. She paused, looking around the room at faces that had completely changed from mocking to respectful attention. "I wear this insignia not for sympathy or special treatment. I wear it to remember why I serve, and to honor the sacrifice that my family made for this country." Commander Patterson nodded slowly, his respect for Sarah evident to everyone in the room. But he wasn't finished with his lesson. He had seen too many good soldiers undermined by ignorance and assumption, and he was determined that this team would not make that mistake. "Lieutenant Mitchell graduated at the top of her class from the Military Intelligence School," Patterson continued, his voice now carrying the tone of a commander defending one of his soldiers. "She has a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies and speaks 3 languages fluently, including Arabic and Pashto." The revelation continued to unfold like layers of an onion being peeled away. Each new piece of information made the earlier mockery seem more and more shameful. Several soldiers were beginning to realize that their assumptions about Sarah's qualifications had been not just wrong, but embarrassingly so. She spent 2 years working with intelligence-gathering operations in Iraq, translating intercepted communications and providing cultural guidance for special operations teams. Patterson went on. Her work directly contributed to the successful completion of 17 high-priority missions and saved the lives of countless American service members. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez felt his earlier confidence crumble completely. He had assumed that Sarah's clean appearance and quiet demeanor meant she had never seen real service. The reality was exactly the opposite. She had been working in some of the most dangerous situations the military had to offer, but doing so in ways that didn't leave obvious marks. The intelligence reports she compiled were so valuable that they were distributed to units across the entire theater of operations. Patterson continued. 3 different commanding officers specifically requested her for their teams, which is unprecedented for someone of her rank and experience level. Private First Class Anderson wanted to disappear into his chair. His jokes about perfect attendance and administrative work now seemed not just cruel but ignorant beyond belief. He thought about the courage it must have taken for Sarah to continue serving after losing her brother, and he felt ashamed of his own small-minded assumptions. Patterson wasn't finished. He could see that his words were having the intended effect, but he wanted to make sure the lesson was complete. Lieutenant Mitchell volunteered for this current assignment specifically because it involves working with local populations in situations where cultural understanding and language skills are critical. She could have chosen a safer posting, but she requested this deployment because she believes her skills can save lives. The weight of these revelations settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Men who had been joking about Sarah's qualifications just minutes before now realized they were in the presence of someone whose service and sacrifice far exceeded their own assumptions about what courage looked like. Sergeant First Class Williams, who prided himself on recognizing military achievements, felt profoundly humbled. He had been looking at Sarah's insignia as some kind of meaningless decoration when it actually represented one of the most profound sacrifices a family could make. His expertise in military insignia suddenly seemed shallow and incomplete. Sarah remained seated quietly, allowing the information to sink in. She could see the change in the men's faces, the shift from mockery to respect, but she felt no satisfaction in their discomfort. She understood that their initial reaction had come from ignorance rather than malice, and she hoped that this moment would teach them something valuable about making assumptions. The Gold Star family insignia represents more than personal loss, Patterson said, his voice now taking on the quality of a chaplain delivering a sermon. It represents the ongoing commitment of families who have paid the ultimate price but continue to serve their country in honor of their fallen loved ones. He looked directly at each soldier in the room, making sure his message was received. When you see someone wearing this insignia, you are looking at someone who understands the true cost of freedom in a way that most of us never will. They carry that knowledge with them every day, and they continue to serve despite that burden. The transformation in the room was complete. Men who had been whispering jokes were now sitting in respectful silence, many of them struggling with their own emotions. The realization of what they had done and what Sarah had endured in silence was overwhelming. Master Sergeant Thompson, who had served 3 tours and seen his share of loss, found himself thinking about the families of soldiers he had known who didn't come home. He realized that he had never really considered what happened to those families, how they continued to live and serve and contribute after their world had been shattered. The mission briefing would continue, but the dynamic in the room had changed forever. Sarah Mitchell was no longer the outsider to be questioned and mocked. She was revealed as someone whose qualifications and commitment to service exceeded most of their own. Someone who had earned her place through sacrifice and dedication rather than any form of special treatment. As Commander Patterson prepared to move on to the operational details, he could see that his lesson had been learned. The men in this room would never again make assumptions about their teammates based on appearance or unfamiliar insignia. More importantly, they now understood that service and sacrifice came in many forms, and that true strength was sometimes carried quietly, with dignity and grace, by those who had every reason to be bitter, but chose to continue serving instead. The mission briefing continued, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Commander Patterson moved through the operational details with his usual precision, but every soldier present was hyper-aware of Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell in a way they hadn't been before. The jokes and whispered comments had been replaced by respectful attention that spoke to the power of understanding over assumption. As Patterson outlined their deployment to a contested region where cultural sensitivity and language skills would be crucial, the earlier mockery seemed not just inappropriate, but dangerously ignorant. The mission would require exactly the kind of expertise that Sarah brought to the table, skills that her teammates had dismissed without bothering to learn what she actually offered. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself paying attention to Sarah's reactions during the briefing in a completely different way. When Patterson mentioned the need for real-time translation of local dialects, Rodriguez noticed how Sarah nodded with the confidence of someone who had done this work before. When the discussion turned to cultural protocols for interacting with village elders, he saw her making detailed notes that suggested deep familiarity with the subject. Private First Class Anderson, still burning with shame over his earlier comments, watched Sarah with the fascination of someone discovering they had completely misjudged a situation. Her quiet confidence during the briefing spoke to experience and competence that he was only now beginning to appreciate. He found himself wondering how many other assumptions he had made about people based on surface appearances. The mission details were complex. They would be working in a region where previous teams had struggled to establish trust with local populations. Multiple operations had failed because of cultural misunderstandings and communication barriers. The success of their mission would depend heavily on their ability to navigate these challenges effectively. Lieutenant Mitchell will serve as our primary cultural liaison and translator, Patterson announced, his words carrying none of the explanation or justification that might have been expected earlier. The soldiers now understood why she had been selected for this role, and none of them questioned her qualifications. Sergeant Martinez, who had made jokes about feel-good awards, now realized that Sarah's presence on the team wasn't about filling quotas or checking boxes. She was there because the mission required her specific expertise. The insignia they had mocked represented not just personal loss but also the kind of commitment to service that made someone volunteer for dangerous assignments even after their family had already paid the ultimate price. As the briefing concluded, Patterson dismissed the group with instructions to review their individual assignments and prepare for departure in 48 hours. The soldiers began filing out of the room, but the usual post-briefing conversations were subdued. Many of the men were processing what they had learned, both about Sarah and about themselves. Master Sergeant Thompson approached Sarah as she gathered her materials. His weathered face showed the uncertainty of someone trying to find the right words for a difficult conversation. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I owe you an apology." Sarah looked up from her notebook, her expression neutral but not hostile. She had been expecting this conversation, though she wasn't sure how she felt about it. "Sergeant Thompson, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "I made assumptions about you based on ignorance, and that was wrong. In 15 years of service, I should have known better." Around the room, other soldiers were having their own moments of reckoning. Corporal Jackson stood near the door, clearly wanting to approach Sarah but uncertain how to begin the conversation. His earlier comment about diversity pins now seemed not just insensitive, but offensive in a way that made him question his own character. Sarah nodded to Thompson, accepting his apology with the grace that had carried her through the earlier mockery. "I understand, Sergeant. We all make assumptions sometimes. What matters is what we do when we learn we were wrong." Her words carried a weight that came from experience with forgiveness. She had learned through her brother's death and its aftermath that holding on to anger and resentment only added to the burden of grief. She had chosen to channel her pain into purpose, her loss into service, and her experience with judgment into understanding. Commander Patterson had remained in the room, observing these interactions with the satisfaction of someone whose lesson had been successfully delivered. He had seen this dynamic play out before, the way ignorance could poison team dynamics until truth intervened, but he had also seen how powerful the learning could be when people were forced to confront their assumptions. Corporal James finally found the courage to approach Sarah. His face was flushed with embarrassment, but he forced himself to make eye contact. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for what happened earlier. I didn't understand what your insignia meant, and I should have asked instead of speculating." "The insignia isn't widely known outside of military families," Sarah replied, her voice kind but firm. "But that's exactly why education matters. When we don't understand something, our first instinct should be to learn, not to mock." Her words contained a lesson that extended far beyond military protocol. In a world where social media and quick judgments often replace thoughtful consideration, Sarah's approach offered a different model. She was teaching these soldiers that true strength sometimes looked like patience in the face of ignorance, and that real leadership meant using difficult moments as opportunities for growth rather than revenge. Private First Class Anderson finally gathered the courage to speak. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "Lieutenant, I said some stupid things earlier, and I'm really sorry. I didn't know what I was talking about." Sarah studied the young soldier for a moment, seeing in his face the same kind of earnestness that a brother had possessed at that age. David had been full of assumptions and quick judgments too, but he had grown into someone who understood the complexity of service and sacrifice. She hoped Anderson had the same potential for growth. "Anderson, right," she said, and he nodded eagerly. "The fact that you're apologizing tells me something important about your character. We all have things to learn. What matters is staying open to those lessons." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with various soldiers approaching to apologize or ask questions about her experience. Sarah answered their questions patiently, understanding that this was a teachable moment that could influence how they treated future teammates. Sergeant First Class Williams, who had prided himself on his knowledge of military insignia, found himself asking Sarah about the specific meaning and history of the Gold Star family pin. He listened intently as she explained the tradition, taking notes like a student eager to fill gaps in his education. "The Gold Star tradition dates back to World War I, Sarah explained. Families would display banners with blue stars for family members serving in the military and gold stars for those who had been killed in action. It was a way for communities to understand which families had made the ultimate sacrifice." As she spoke, the soldiers began to understand not just what the insignia meant, but why it mattered so much that they had mocked it. This wasn't just a personal symbol for Sarah, it was part of a larger tradition of honoring military sacrifice that stretched back generations. Master Sergeant Thompson found himself thinking about his own family and the Blue Star banner his mother had displayed during his deployments. He wondered how she would have felt if that star had been changed to gold, and how the community would have treated her differently. The weight of what Gold Star families carried began to sink in. Commander Patterson finally addressed the group as a whole. "What happened here today was valuable, but it shouldn't have been necessary. As military professionals, we should approach our teammates with respect, and the assumption that they earned their place until proven otherwise." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each soldier. "Lieutenant Mitchell didn't owe any of you an explanation of her insignia or her qualifications. She was professional enough to maintain her composure while you questioned her presence on this team. That kind of grace under pressure is exactly what we need in the field." The lesson was clear, and the soldiers absorbed it with the seriousness it deserved. They had witnessed firsthand how assumptions could damage team cohesion, and more importantly, how they could cause unnecessary pain to someone who had already sacrificed more than they initially understood. As the group prepared to leave, Sarah found herself surrounded by teammates who were now eager to learn from her rather than mock her. The transformation was complete, but she felt no sense of triumph. Instead, she hoped that the lesson would stick, and that these soldiers would carry this experience forward into future interactions. In the days that followed, the team's preparation for their mission took on a different character. Sarah's expertise was sought out and valued, her input welcomed rather than questioned. The soldiers who had made jokes about her insignia now found themselves defending her qualifications to outsiders who questioned why she was on the team. The mission itself, when it came, relied heavily on Sarah's cultural knowledge and language skills. Her ability to communicate with local populations and navigate complex social protocols proved essential to their success. The men who had once dismissed her contributions now understood that her presence wasn't just helpful, it was crucial. Months later, when the team returned from their deployment, several of the soldiers would tell the story of that first briefing to other units. Not as a joke about their initial assumptions, but as a cautionary tale about the danger of judging teammates based on appearances or unfamiliar symbols. Private First Class Anderson, who had matured significantly during the deployment, would eventually become an advocate for Gold Star families, educating other soldiers about the significance of their sacrifice. His transformation from someone who mocked what he didn't understand to someone who educated others became a model for how people can grow from their mistakes. The insignia that had once been the subject of mockery became a symbol of respect within the unit. When new soldiers joined the team, the story of Lieutenant Mitchell and the lessons learned from that first briefing became part of their orientation. The Gold Star pin served as a reminder that every symbol, every person, and every story deserved consideration before judgment. Sarah continued to serve with distinction, her brother's memory driving her to excel in ways that honored his sacrifice. The insignia remained on her collar, no longer a target for mockery but a recognized symbol of the price some families pay for freedom. Her quiet dignity and professional excellence became the standard against which other team members measured themselves. The transformation in that briefing room became legendary within military circles, a story told not to embarrass those who had learnt the hard lesson, but to prevent others from making the same mistakes. It became a reminder that respect must be earned through understanding, and that the strongest among us sometimes carry their burdens with such grace that we mistake their strength for weakness. Commander Patterson would later say that the incident was one of the most powerful teaching moments he had witnessed in his career. It demonstrated how quickly ignorance could be replaced by respect when people were willing to listen and learn. More importantly, it showed how one person's dignity and patience could transform an entire group's understanding of service and sacrifice. The gold star insignia that Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell wore was no longer just a symbol of her family's loss. It had become a symbol of the power of education over assumption, of patience over anger, and of the quiet strength that continues to serve even after paying the ultimate price. The lesson learned in that briefing room would influence every interaction those soldiers had for the rest of their careers, a lasting testament to the power of understanding over judgment. Everyone mocked her insignia. One question from the SEAL commander stopped them cold.